horror movies, horror books, horror video games, every genre of entertainment has the scary except for music. Is that true? Not really. We have horrorcore, okay? Horrorcore sounds like this. No, I don't know about you, but I'm not very scared by this. And so begins the journey of today, ladies and gentlemen, because I've been thinking about this for about a month now, okay? What is scary music? So as with anything that is scary, different people are scared by different things. Some people are scared of elevators, some people are scared of sharks, and so all I really can do is give a perspective on what gets under my skin. So where does that lead us?
Loud does not equal scary.
I would definitely not be the first person to claim that something like jump scares are pretty weak forms of attempting to get an adrenaline rush from the audience, and not really something that is truly scary. So what can make something scary? Okay, well, different mediums have their different forms of horror, right? So, like, movies and video games can play with certain visual ideas such as gore or imagery for shock value. Books, in a way, are much more limited by not being very visual, often having to rely on suspense or detailed writing to convey the fright. Well, of course, films and games have this option too. But, ladies and gentlemen, there's at least one form that all of these different mediums have in common when it comes to horror, and that is psychological horror. That's right. I mean, you can think of something like Silence of the Lambs as a movie. You can think of The House of Leaves as a book, a great example of a psychological horror. Or, of course, in video games, you got something like Doki Doki Literature Club. I did not say that, okay? That wasn't me. That I did. And so the subject of today, bring out the board. What music can possibly exist that can incite a psychological horror sense into the listener and convey horror across in a meaningful way, utilizing the limitations and niches of the aural nature of music? To be a bit more precise here, does horror exist in music? Let me tell you what, I would sure think that it is if I was just to ask the question and given 2 seconds to respond and say, oh, well, yeah, sure, there's scary music. But let me tell you what, I have the advantage of having already written this video. I'm going to give a little bit of spoiler. I've already done that. I don't know. Okay, so let's start off with going off of the presumption that horror music must exist, something that I did not believe was a very absurd proposition before. So where can we look with that? Well, we can certainly start with something that I believe to be a frightening use of music and something that I will call contextual music. It's the concept of taking a song that isn't necessarily scary by itself. In fact, it might be very wholesome, but placing it into a context that sort of perverts it and gets you that sort of uncanny sensation listening to the song in the context that adds to the fright factor. A very common example of this would be, of course, children's music in horror movies or in horror scenes in films. But at the same time, it isn't really the music that is scary. It is more the reliance on the audience's preconceptions than just something original that creates horror with the music alone. And yeah, I think this can be an effective use of music to create horror, but it isn't really horror music. Okay, so how could we find something that takes music as a form in and of itself and turns it into something scary? Okay, then we can look at concept albums as an example. Now, concept albums, of course, aren't inherently scary, but the idea of an album telling a story certainly opens it up to the possibility of creating tension, creating scary themes, horror within the story itself. So then, of course, you can get something like an absolute classic example, a Braille-approved example, with something like Tom Waits' The Black Rider. But what is so scary about this album, you might ask? Well, okay. Well, this is not only a concept album, but it was actually written in part for a play. Now, this play was written by Tom Waits and famous beat writer William S. Burroughs. Now, Mr. Burroughs is notoriously a frequent semi-autobiographical author, and this is no exception. You see, on the day of his second wedding, while attempting a drunken William Tell, he shot and killed his new wife, and that is the story that influenced The Black Rider. But I do want to make it clear that while this album was written in tandem with the play, and of course was based on a real event, this album is very much its own thing that can exist outside of the context of the play or outside of the context of its influence and tell its own story. So this is not another example of contextual horror, because you don't need to know the context behind it to still be impacted by its storytelling. And one of the ways that Tom Waits creates a sense of unease and a scary atmosphere is the use of a lot of surrealism in the lyrics. So lyrically, a song like November laments how much the narrator hates November, at least that's what it seems, but the word choice from Waits is extremely abstract. Stick your spoon in the wall and we'll slaughter them all. November has tied me to an old dead tree. Get word to April to rescue me. Taking that in the context of the fairly foreign musical influences from contemporary French and German folk music, it creates a very distinct and haunting and surreal atmosphere for the record to exist in. Taking things even more abstract, we of course have the ever-popular internet phenomena that was The Caretakers everywhere at the end of time. Taken as a collective, this series of records is a 6.5-hour journey through experimental ambient, distortion, and musical avant-garde tendencies. But what truly makes this a horror-adjacent record is, again, the concept. The concept of this record is to attempt to musically depict the fall into dementia. From the beginning, where the music is fairly clear and distinct, through to the very end, where all you really have are little glimpses of the memory of earlier in the record. And the whole record takes you through the frightening reality of the concept of forgetting. It's a haunting experience both with and without the concept of the album, and a really interesting example of creating horror without the use of lyrical storytelling. But of course you also have relevant concept albums that are on the complete opposite side of the spectrum that aren't abstract at all. Something like Lou Reed's Berlin is a great example here because it is so sad and so painfully direct. It tells the story of a couple from their first meeting in Berlin through the tragic story of drugs, abuse, parental troubles, and eventually the collapse of the will to live. Now, Lou Reed was never really that abstract of a writer, and that is definitely the case here too, because he pulls no punches in his visceral description of the relationship between these two characters. If you want a taste of this, Caroline 2 is by no means an easy song, but definitely a song that I think gets my point across. Caroline says as she gets up from the floor, "You can hit me all you want to, but I don't love you anymore." And yes, that is certainly a sad story, I think that we'd all agree on that. But what elevates this record into the genre that I would call horror music is its continual descent into pure helplessness. It seems that every single song gets more and more depressing, that the listener is constantly waiting for a release. And just like Caroline in the story, never really manages to escape until, well... So I think that it's safe to say that certain concept albums can absolutely be defined as horror music. But what if we want to get even more precise here? What about specific songs? I've heard many examples of songs that I would qualify under this category, and I immediately think of someone like Momus. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if you had never heard of Mr. Curie before, but Momus was, and is, an extremely lyrical artist who, as the name suggests, deals a lot with mockery and satire in his lyrics. Well, with Momus, you get something like The Guitar Lesson, in a song that opens with the line, "The pupil is 12. Now, I won't spoil the story for you, but I will tell you that it is an absolutely horrific song, but not a graphic one. And that's one of the ways that I think that Momus is such a genius at this type of songwriting. He uses suspense as a constant sense of pulling the curtain around the listener that is almost hard to describe. It's like with a song like The Guitar Lesson. The listener is likely to want to believe that the story isn't heading in the direction that they may think that it is going to. And occasionally Momus will throw you off the track, as if he was all just a bit of a goof playing with the audience's expectations. But then he'll throw in a few lines in between to reinforce that this is truly something sinister, before the full realization from the audience is made, revealing the horrific nature of the lyric. And it wasn't just that Momus was telling a scary story. It was that part of the horror here is the realization that it is, in fact, horrific. Definitely a niche approach to songwriting, but a very interesting one nonetheless. Then you can also go on the more abstract side of songwriting here too, with something like Scott Walker's later work in Bish Bosh or Tilt. I mean, just listen to the way that Bish Bosh opens. The repetition is so unrelenting and ruthless, and the song is called "See That You Don't Bump His Head," which just adds an even more strange element to it. And the lyrics are almost nonsensical, relating back to William Burroughs and his famous cut-up technique. The cut-up technique, of course, famously is a style of writing where you would write out individual sentences, then mix them up amongst themselves to create a story almost at random. While plucking feathers from a swan song, spring might gently press its thumb against your eyes. While plucking feathers from a swan song, a cobweb melts within a womb. while plucking feathers from a swan song, an incontinent is singing Scarpia. If that isn't horror music, I really don't know what is. But then we can also add another subcategory here with something that I will call cognitive dissonant songs. Now, some forms of media, like games and movies, have many elements to use at their disposal, like visuals, sounds, writing, space, and all that. Books, not so much. They really only have one, with some exceptions to something like visual novels. But music is at a strange middle ground, because we essentially have two. Now, I hope that I'm not derailing here entirely, but I just want to point out the fact that the existence of the two separate forms of musical sense, such as the lyrics and the vocalization of something, and the music itself, the more instrumental backing to, I guess you would call a pop song, because of course not all songs necessarily fit this category, but you know what I mean. The existence of these two separate entities can create something truly unique and interesting when they are at odds with one another. So I think a great example would be Steely Dan's Everyone's Gone to the Movies. Steely Dan, of course, named after famous implement in William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, the song features a very joyful-sounding, tropical, almost calypso instrumentation, with lyrics that are very sinister and predatory, making it a song that sort of tricks the listener, creating horror in a similar way to the Momus example, and in a similar way to the band's name itself, I suppose. Knowing the song and listening to it isn't necessarily scary. The scary part is the realization of what it is actually about. And now we're back to where we started, because here I am trying to find out what defines horror music, what could be a genre qualifier that makes horror music its own unique thing. And the only constant that I have found that has existed through the subversive songs, through the concept albums, through the cognitive dissonant songs, is William S. Burroughs. Is this a coincidence, ladies and gentlemen? Maybe. But now let's go on to the last category here. We're moving on from cognitive dissonance into straight up dissonance. And really the true question at this point is, do we find William Burroughs here too? Okay, well I would say that there is something to an album like Sonic Youth's Evil in the way that dissonance is used to create tension. Now, it isn't just tension in the lyrical sense where you're creating suspense, as an example, although that is certainly still present. But it's something to the actual use of musical dissonance, the playing notes that do not belong together, but putting them together, and making them sound so correct, and so strange, and so off-putting that it's just wonderful. And it adds so much texture to the atmosphere of a song like Shadow of a Doubt, which is a Sonic Youth track, of course, based off of the story of Strangers on a Train. And what might be even more interesting, of course, Sonic Youth started as a no-wave band, the very dissonant, very angular music. They sort of moved away to that into more structured noise rock. But then in the year 2000, they sort of switched back into that dissonant no-wave sound with the ever-infamous album, of course, NYC Ghosts and Flowers, which features cover art from no one less than William S. Burroughs. So what do we know about horror music, ladies and gentlemen? Does it exist? It seems like it, but it seems like there's nothing really that connects it to itself. There isn't a genre that this all falls under. All of these albums, from Lou Reed's Berlin to Bish Bosh to Everywhere at the End of Time, these are all completely different genres that all share a similar trait in the fact that they are scary. Maybe? I don't know. That's up to, again, not an elevator. I don't know. Of course, horror is subjective, but it seems the one constant is William S. Burroughs, ladies and gentlemen. Yes! But yes, ladies and gentlemen, of course, as of recording this video, we are coming up on Halloween, and so I thought it would just be a fun, interesting idea to do a video on the concept of horror music. Maybe we're smack dab in the middle of July, depending on when you're watching this video, but, you know, I guess that doesn't really matter. There are a few records that I play every year around October. The quintessential example is, of course, Tom Waits' The Black Rider. I love this album so much. Go listen to this album. Maybe read some William Burroughs, and go listen to Tom Waits' The Black Rider. That is the real concept behind this video. The real concept of this video were the friends that we made along the way, ladies and gentlemen. So maybe, what is the scariest song that you have ever heard, and why? I would love to know that. And, you know, might be working on something big in the background, so stay tuned for that. Hopefully this will be a short little fun video that'll satiate your needs until we get to the something big. But ladies and gentlemen, in the meantime, I want to leave you with this, and it's going to be flipped, so sorry about that. This is one of my most prized possessions, one of my favorite records that I have. It's been played to death through multiple generations, and I play it for everyone that I can, so hope you guys enjoy.
Run, catch me if you can. If you can't get me, why not do the best man? I run away from a little old woman I've can.